koutou katoa. My name's Mark. I'm with the Wellington Socialist Society, and I'm going to be chairing tonight's session, talking about Chile and neoliberalism. I'm going to introduce Pablo in a minute. Well, this is Pablo, but I'll do the proper intro in a minute. But one of the reasons Pablo ended up here is because I'm old, born in the South Island in 1968, so 56. And when I left school, and the first time I voted was 1987, and I didn't know much about politics, but I knew whose side I was on, so I voted Labour in 1987, right? Which means I wasn't paying attention, because it was a neoliberal government, and it was the second term of the fourth Labour government, and I voted for a guy who turned out to be, what was his name? He was the Deputy Finance Minister, one of Roger Douglas's sidekicks. He was the local MP, so I voted for a neoliberal asshole without knowing him. Then I left school, and all the people I knew at school, or maybe not at school, but all the people I fell in with were unemployed, and I was unemployed, and I spent years unemployed, and it was just normal, right? Late 80s, early 90s in Christchurch. Working class kid, left school, no qualifications, you're unemployed. That's just how it was, I thought. So most of my adult life, I've lived under this system that, in those days, I didn't know what it was called. It was just normal. Never had a job, unemployed. I got into doing activist stuff, mainly politicised by the 1991 benefit cuts, because everyone rejected Labour neoliberalism by voting National, which made it worse. And so they brought in the Employment Contracts Act, which we've heard, I'm just make sure this is the right volume. The Employment Contracts Act came in 1990, 91, I think. Which I was involved in the protest there, but not as a union organiser, just as a young troublemaker in Christchurch. But the benefit cuts really affected us and my social group of young unemployed people. That, we lost 25% of our income overnight, and we were really angry. Obviously, we were young and single and unemployed, so it was not as bad as it was if you were unemployed families. But that's kind of what radicalised me and got me into radical politics, and spent most of the 90s and 2000s involved in anarchist politics, and doing all sorts of different issues, campaigns, all that kind of stuff. And as I got more involved, I started thinking and learning about politics, and started learning about this thing, neoliberalism. And I started reading books like Jane Kelsey's books, The Fire Economy, and a few others. There's a few of them. Maria Barge's book Resistance on Maori responses to neoliberalism. Watching films like Alistair Barry's documentary called Someone Else's Country. And all these books and all these films all started with a little anecdote about Chile, and about what happened in Chile in the 1970s. There was a military coup there. Democracy was overthrown, a right-wing dictatorship came in, and then that right-wing dictatorship started experimenting with this new idea that became neoliberal economics. And it was forced on the Chileans, and then a few years later, unbeknownst to little old me going out voting for the first time in New Zealand, it was brought in by a so-called left-wing government. So as I learned more about it, I realised that all the problems we're facing, not all of them, but a lot of them were based on this economic system that I thought was normal, and it was called neoliberalism. And the more I read about it, the more I read about Chile, and Chile is somehow connected to this. So a few years ago, my partner got to go to a work conference in Chile, and I thought, I'll go along too and stay in a free hotel. And while she's working, I will charge around Santiago learning about Chile, and learned a little bit of Spanish, shit amount of Spanish, but tourist Spanish. And the plan was we'd spend 2 weeks in Chile, and I would go to the museums and check out the politics and try and understand Chile and find out about what had happened there and how it was related to what happened in New Zealand. Obviously it's going to be different, but it was always like Chile was this interesting place to me. The politics of Chile was somehow connected to what's happening here. So I was really interested, planned out the holiday. The day we arrived in Santiago, huge traffic jams, something was weird, no one was moving, and I thought, this city is very disorganised, there's something wrong going on here. And my partner, whose Spanish was better than mine, slightly overheard people talking, and she said, I think they're talking about a protest. And I was like, okay, what's a protest? I can't see any protest, all I can see is traffic jams. So we got to a hotel, And a friend of mine, a contact I had, who was Chilean, said, when you get there, pop into the local radical bookshop. There's a guy on duty on Fridays who speaks English. His name's Pablo. So I went in and we met Pablo. And Pablo said, it's been quite a full-on day. There's been a big riot. And he will tell me more about what happened. And it turned out to be the first day of this massive revolt against austerity and neoliberalism in 2019. And we were lucky enough to walk into the riots on the first day. And we left Pablo, went back to the hotel, got tear gassed on the way, and got caught up in a massive riot. And then our holiday, so my partner's library conference was cancelled. And we spent the whole 2 weeks in Chile, never actually leaving the central city, because the city was in chaos. There was a military curfew brought in. The second day we saw soldiers on the streets, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm reading about Chile and the coup, and I think I'm in another one. Yeah, it was kind of terrifying. But then the third day, Chileans came out on the street, like hundreds of thousands of them. And I always say it's the nearest thing to a revolution that I've ever seen. This massive uprising. So we were there for 2 weeks. It was a massive protest, and as we left, the protest started changing into that people were still shouting and stuff, but people started sitting down in parks and having arguments and meetings. They were talking about changing the constitution and rewriting things and changing Chile for the better. We didn't see Pablo again because he was quite busy. So we left Chile, went back, and then meet some of the local Chilean community. I hope there was someone here, some of the people we met, and followed it ever since. And it kind of it changed my politics, like seeing the potential of a mass movement. It was really kind of inspiring and kind of scary, but it was really changed the way I look at politics. And I always thought, what we saw in Chile was really life-changing, I suppose. So when we did this conference, we were talking about the theme, which Tom made up our theme about the dual crisis of capitalism and colonialism, and we were thinking, who should we get as an international speaker? And I said, what about that guy Pablo? So we contacted Pablo and talked him into coming, and he's going to speak to us tonight about what happened after my little holiday in Chile. The good and the bad. It was pretty dramatic, and maybe, I don't know, there could be equal parts good and bad. Maybe there's more bad. We'll find out. But anyway, let's just do the fast on this. So, Pablo is a fourth generation Palestinian in Chile. He's a philosopher, translator, and soon-to-be biologist. He's been involved in struggles against neoliberalism in Chile for about 20 years, as a student organiser, as an activist for the new pension system, community organiser during the 2019 revolt, and a member of the political movement Socialist. And more recently, he was a spokesperson for my Spanish is terrible, Coordinadora por Palestina, a movement of social movements against genocide and for Palestinian liberation. He's also done a lot of writing on Chilean politics, which has been published in Jacobin, NACLA Report on the Americas, Viento Sur, Rebellion.org, Anarchismo.net, Contretemps, which is French, and I'm definitely saying that wrong, Amandla, and a whole bunch of other publications. So I'll hand it over to Pablo. He's going to talk, and then after that we'll have a little break and then a Q&A kind of thing. But for now, Pablo, go.
Thanks, Mark. That was impressive, amazing. First of all, ¿hay algún chilena aquí en la sala? Bien, qué bueno. Good to see you. Well, I'm very happy to be here. I'm very, very grateful to the Federation of Socialist Societies for having me. This is my first time in New Zealand, and I've been learning. I think I got here 3 days ago, and I've been learning a lot. And of course, I try to prepare for this trip, trying to understand the dynamics and then the parallels and the differences between Chile and Aotearoa. And I think that there's a lot of history in common, even though we're coming from very different historical backgrounds and social composition, etc. But I think that there's a lot in common, and I think I understand why it makes sense that a Chilean is here for this conference. Two things. Since Latin America has been the backyard of the United States for so long, probably my English will sound more to the American side than other accents, so I just wanted to apologize for that. I wish I had a Kiwi accent. That would be much better. And the second thing is that I wrote something because I trust that I could convey a better message if I wrote something and read it. But I know that this could be boring, so I'll try to be as histrionic as possible. And also, if I see someone sleeping, I'll try to keep it down, not to wake you up. So the title of this talk is Resisting Neoliberalism in Latin America, the 2019 Chilean revolt and the struggle for constitutional reform. And I'll try to address the keywords there. So let's go. On November 14, 2018, a police commando shot the young Mapuche, Camilo Catrillanca, to death, and then detained and tortured the boy who accompanied him. The Mapuche are the main indigenous people in Chile who have been resisting colonialism for hundreds of years. Mapuche means tangata whenua, people of the land. And I think we will find more similarities between Chile and Aotearoa. The police finally destroyed the evidence in their cameras and set out to become part of a web of lies that was articulated from Wallmapu, the Mapuche territory, to the presidential palace of La Moneda and the media. Camilo became the name and the face of the victims of state violence against the Mapuche people, and his murder was inscribed in the history of the recent Chilean historical moment, I think, as the starting point of the political crisis that led to the revolt of 2019. During the protests for Camilo that happened throughout the country, the rage already smelled different in the streets of Santiago. A year later, as we gathered in a square in downtown Santiago, where weeks ago the neighborhood's popular assembly had begun to organize, my neighbor Miguel enthusiastically raised his left fist and shouted along with more than 100 other people, "The people united will never be defeated." You know that this is a Chilean folk song, but also a slogan that has troubled the world. And Miguel, my neighbor, he's a veteran of the struggle against the dictatorship, and we had been working for several weeks to organize our neighborhood in the context of a wave of mass protests that shook the country for months since October 18th, the day that Mark and Catherine arrived. Miguel looked at me with a huge smile and teary eyes. Then, going back a few days, on the second day of the revolt, talking about the tactics that people were using to confront the police or build neighborhood assemblies, my friend and comrade Karina, a long-time anti-capitalist and feminist activist, told me, well, the people are picking up the fight where they left off last time. The beauty and the power of this image was transforming for me, because a society in the process of transformation entails a transformed form of struggle. So the October Revolt had a strongly intergenerational, plurinational, and feminist character, since it is an expression of the resistance of a highly precarious, fragmented working class, whose internal diversity in terms of gender, race, and nation is intertwined with urban segregation and the multiplicity of ideological expressions that have been finding their place on the map of the popular sectors. Now, let's do some history. I think there are three key historical periods that can help us explain the current political situation in Chile. The neoliberal 90s, the turbulent 2000s, and the turning point of 2019. First, in the early years of the post-dictatorship, a center-left administration continued the neoliberal policies of the Pinochet dictatorship between 1973 and 1990. These administrations approved some democratic reforms that allowed the center-left parties of the coalition to present themselves as doing more than simply deepening the economic program of the dictatorship. So instead, with the neoliberal credo of the Chicago Boys, the new political elite focused on reducing extreme poverty while increasing access to consumption, but through private debt. So in Chile, people buy food and clothes using credit cards, like in most indebted countries. So the Chilean miracle became defined by a society of new homeowners, car owners, and cell phone users. For some, it also included higher education degrees. But this new society also included a dark underbelly, precarious jobs, unsustainable debt, and growing inequality between the poor and the rich. The dictatorship legacy of privatization of social services like healthcare, pensions, and education reinforced this inequality by enabling a process of forced segregation in urban peripheries, decaying hospitals and schools, and a polluted environment. Second period. A decade after the end of the dictatorship in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis that hit Chilean shores between 1997 and 1999, a burst of popular responses shook the neoliberal normality in Chile. Such grassroots actions included student mobilizations, labor unrest, indigenous resistance to the toxic mix of colonialism and super-exploitation of natural resources, and land occupations led by poor families looking for a dignified place to live. The student movement played a central role in shaking off the optimism of the 90s. 2006, 2011, massive student protests and occupations of schools and universities represented a watershed moment. And we have to remember that the current president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, and some ministers were part of that generation of 2011. These students were part of a new generation that grew under democratic conditions, or at least not under the immediate militarized threat of torture, exile, and forced disappearance. They were not afraid to confront the neoliberal regime and demand what was promised to them. The student movement, together with the feminist, indigenous, and environmentalist movements and communities deeply impacted by the extractive economy, like in Chile, it's mining, forestry, agribusiness, energy production, they all became the living fragments of an organized people that demanded structural change in a rigid capitalist society. So throughout the slow recomposition of the working class during the post-dictatorship period, a set of social demands emerged that reflected the contradictions of the Chilean model and of course the legacy of the dictatorship. So these social demands included an end to profit-making in the educational system, a new pension system that was based on solidarity distribution and not forced individual savings, decent social housing, political and territorial autonomy for indigenous peoples, legal abortion, a labor code that guaranteed the right to strike and bargaining by industry, a single publicly financed health and care system among others. It was possible to detect in these demands a common thread in what came to be called social rights, those aspects of the reproduction of any person's life that should be guaranteed but are not by the Chilean state. And third, during the 2010s, significant mass mobilizations became the immediate backdrop of the revolt in 2019. And I just want to point to one mass mobilization that I think it's maybe the most relevant to how Chilean society has changed in the past years. In May 2018, a rapidly growing feminist movement launched a new attack on Chile's patriarchal system. Students from high school and universities across the country demanded an end to rape culture, sexual violence, and the social exclusion of women and the LGBT community. Overcoming the obstacles of a male-centered student movement, the activists of this feminist May, as it came to be known, created their own vocabulary and organizations to confront patriarchy and establish alliances with other sectors of society. it soon became clear that feminism in Chile meant much more than working toward gender equality, and feminist demands emerged as an unavoidable fixture in every social movement and political organization. This is what the feminist group, the March 8th feminist coordinator called the transversalization of feminism, that feminism should be part of every social movement and not just like a small part of the platform. The same group, the Coordinadora Feminista 8M, called for a feminist general strike in March of 2019, which gathered millions in Santiago and the rest of the country. And this is interesting because it combined the old and proven tactics of the strike by the labor movement, but that were left behind by a very disorganized labor movement, and it was taken by the feminist movement very successfully. And this movement was also armed with a democratically debated platform, what they called the Program Against the Precarity of Life. The new feminist movement became a relevant political actor, and the feminist general strike turned out to be the direct precursor of the October 19 revolt. Now, the revolt in itself, what happened between October 2019 and March 2020, is very hard to describe. It was less than a revolution, that's for sure, but more than just a mass movement. Decades of accumulated precariousness in our lives suddenly became months of protests and grassroots self-organization, sparked by an increase in the subway fare, just 30 pesos, I think that's like 5 cents in New Zealand dollars. The government, of course, replied with repression, declaring a state of emergency, which Mark was able to see, and taking the military to the streets, which only reopened the wounded memories of dictatorial times. During the revolt, we saw a slow articulation of demands that included an end to military crackdown on protesters, the resignation of the president, right-wing Sebastián Piñera, who's happily dead now, because of well-documented human rights violations, and the establishment of universal social rights, which was part of the 2000s mass movements that I was speaking before. And this last aspect of the demands, this universal social rights, were formulated over decades by various social movements, parties, and unions, and this quickly occupied public opinion in the first days of the October Revolt. But suddenly, a leap in the register of demands was beginning to take shape. A strong emphasis on pensions and health that were central dimensions of the crisis of social reproduction in Chile gave way to a slogan that made it possible to encompass the issue of social rights in a single political demand. We want a constituent assembly. We want a change in the constitution. A constitution that was written and implemented by the dictatorship in a very fraudulent referendum in 1980. So this means that I think that this is where we find the greatest leap in the political consciousness of the working class in Chile as a result of the October Revolt. The idea of a constituent assembly was presented as a radically progressive demand as far as it identified the source of the problem in a structural and global dimension, which requires much more than public policy adjustments or specific laws. So it's not just about one or two reforms or bills, it's about changing, at least politically, the whole framework. So following weeks and months of, weeks in November of national mass protests, a very highly disoriented political establishment across the board that had so far responded exclusively with armed repression and excuses, decided to find a political solution to the crisis by accepting a constitutional process. Negotiations in Congress led to all but two of the political parties with parliamentary representation to sign what they called the Agreement for Social Peace and a New Constitution that was on November 15, 2019. the agreement for social peace and a new constitution. So leaving aside the highly problematic idea of the need for a peace treaty to respond to civil unrest, the agreement left a bitter taste in everyone's mouth, both in Congress and in the streets. The right wing didn't want to erase the constitution drafted during the dictatorship, of course. The left, the more radical left, was forced to accept a very restrictive constituent process that gave too much power to Congress to define the contours of the deliberations. And the center-left parties that at that point were weakened by the loss in the previous presidential election were happy that they could broker a deal between the other two, the right and the left. But the people who had revolted, the popular sectors that were organized in neighborhood assemblies and social movements, the millions that couldn't take it anymore, decided that even with its restrictions, the constitutional process was a worthy challenge to take on. And so, maybe this is like a spoiler, a necessary spoiler. We lost. In September 2022, this constitutional draft was rejected. But let's try to forget that for a moment and remember that this proposed constitution, this project of a new constitution for Chile, was drafted democratically in a year-long constitutional convention. The traditional parties of the political establishment were in a minority, complete minority, and representatives that embodied the anti-neoliberal sentiment were in the majority. The draft reflected the demands that had been raised by leftist parties, labor unions, community organizations, and social movements during the neoliberal 90s and the turbulent 2000s. And the significance of this fact cannot be overstated. The vision of a new society that was articulated in the draft can and probably will be the starting point of every struggle from now on. Importantly, the Constitutional Convention included the participation of representatives from organized sectors of the people, mainly feminist and eco-socialist groups, as well as a quota for indigenous movements. And up until 2020, these groups had concentrated their work on building social struggles and making demands to a state that excluded them from direct institutional participation. However, through the convention, these social movements and popular organizations gained the political experience of practicing self-representation in political terms. This process of participation paved the way for a new moment of political opportunity for those organizations that had been previously dedicated to social struggle alone. The representatives of social movements and their experiences in the Constitutional Convention provided them with first-hand knowledge of the workings of institutional power, an arena that is covered with political landmines for newcomers, to be sure. But this process also created potential opportunities for new levels of popular self-organization enabled by public visibility and access to new resources. Those two things I think are very important and may be part of the lessons of radical leftist officials in institutions. So seen in this slide, the October 2019 revolt and the constitutional process both represented moments of political emergence for Chile's popular sectors. During the revolt, the loosely coordinated demands and struggles of the past 2 decades coalesced around the shared experience of fighting together from below against the elites. During the constitutional process, this experience was translated into a draft of a new constitution that would guarantee social and economic rights and reimagine the meaning of democracy, departing completely from the 1980 charter. But the first battle in this new moment of political emergence ended in a defeat at the ballot box on September 4th, 2022. 67% of the population voted against this wonderful project. So eventually we'll have to talk about why that happened. But organized sectors of the working class in Chile have advanced, definitely, in at least two significant areas. They have built a platform for change in the form of a draft of a constitution, and they have gained unprecedented political experience. So in the context of a defeated process of constitutional reform, these two advances represent the unstable ground upon which to restart the process of change that the Chilean people have experienced in recent years. The Boric administration was part of that process of change at some point, but its political moves toward the center immediately before and after the September referendum, its alliances with the old guard of the parties that managed the deepening of neoliberalism during the 90s, and its hesitant attitude toward the constitutional process all confirmed the need for independent political action by Chile's popular sectors. The new elite, the new government of the progressive youth that came from the student movement is not to be trusted, not anymore at least. And this, I think, this constituent politics, if we can call it that, in a post-revolt Chile must draw lessons from previous political processes, such as the struggles for women's suffrage and the socialist experiments of Salvador Allende's popular unity revolution. In this sense, historical memory can become the horizon for a new society or a memory for the future. We were definitely defeated on the electoral ground. We lost the political initiative. We feel disoriented and demoralized. But the ground on which the revolt took place and the reasons for its eruption are still very much the same. It's a series of intertwined crises that can either be drowned under the authoritarian boot of a neo-fascist regime, which is happening in some countries, even in Latin America, or that can be overcome by structural transformations that include a radical redistribution of wealth and land, and by this, of course, in this context of a socialist conference, I mean expropriation from capitalists, not only taxation and regulation of business, and a radical transformation of our political institutions, and by this I mean popular power, a socialist democracy in which the working majority has more power than the corporate minority. I don't know how much time do I have, if I'm being too boring already. Okay. So I want to move from the historical perspective to a more maybe critical or theoretical one. And this is, maybe it has to do with the theme of this conference, of the dual crisis. I'll try to be nice with my disagreements with the idea of a dual crisis. We normally know what we mean when we say neoliberalism, at least roughly. We mean a program of structural reforms that include economic measures such as the privatization of public companies, commodification of public or previously non-private social services like education, deregulation of labor relations, and an opening of the national economy to foreign capitals. It also involves political measures regarding democratic participation, creating democratic simulacra when it comes to relevant decisions concerning the environment, our safety, or power in general. We know also that in countries that have been built on colonial foundations, this always involves an even more extreme form of exclusion and attacks on indigenous peoples. Moreover, neoliberalism is the name we give to the way of life that is induced by all these transformations, including a tendency towards consumerism, individualism, and the destruction of community values and institutions. And always, without exception, neoliberal transformations have been violently non-liberal and have been imposed or accompanied by brutal repression of workers, peasants, and communities willing to resist the destruction of everything that gives any dignity to their existence. So we understand neoliberalism as a sort of phase or a stage in the development of capitalism, or a kind of extreme capitalism. We also tend to see neoliberalism, and this is I think, the most important point for me, we tend to see neoliberalism as a plan or a predefined set of policies that get to be implemented by national governments under the guidance of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The Washington Consensus, we say, to abbreviate that set of policies and the imperial power that they mostly benefit. Those more inclined to history perhaps point towards the Mount Pelerin Society, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, the Chicago Boys, that toured the world preaching the sacred gospel of low inflation rates, total deregulation, and open society. Oh, and let's not forget about the four horse people of the apocalypse: Augusto Pinochet, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Roger Douglas. All these facts about neoliberalism are very hard to challenge because they actually describe our contemporary world in a very concrete way. But after decades of struggle against the political and economic regime that we have called neoliberalism, I would like to call into question some of these assumptions. I think we need to question the notion that neoliberalism is a perverse plan that is imposed by the ruling classes, as if they have complete control over the levers of power and the economy and can willingly transform them. Wherever these transformations have taken place, it has been as a local response to the global economic downturns and crises, where national economies have been confronted with slow growth and resistance from organized labor, all derived from a decrease in the rate of profit for local capitalists. It is the capitalist mode of production in itself that is perverse, and not the way in which its political representatives implement the changes that are necessary to keep business running, and that they do with the best interest of the people at their heart, of course. The important thing about this question, this challenge of this notion of neoliberalism as a perverse plan, is that it may lead us to think beyond the logic of dismantling, deconstructing neoliberalism, which I think is the wrong metaphor for a highly complex and irreversible historical process, and move towards the logic of transforming the structural conditions of capitalism, whether they are neoliberal or not. And also, just a note, it can also help us see that neoliberal policies can happen in socialist governments or so-called socialist governments, like Nicaragua, where you have like people everywhere defending the government, and because they are against the US, of course, that's a good thing. I'm sure that Vijay Prashad agrees with that. I don't know if he agrees with the fact that Ortega has also implemented IMF policies in the country. So neoliberalism is not, so it's not like a set of policies. It can be like structural adjustments in countries that call themselves socialist or whatever. So for me, it's going beyond the idea that we have to dismantle neoliberalism and go towards a logic of transforming the structural conditions of capitalism, whether they are neoliberal or not. I believe that we need to reach beyond the now mythical notion of neoliberalism, which it means so many things that at some point it means nothing, towards an actual analysis of the current historical moment. For instance, from a Latin American point of view, it is very clear that the post-war economic boom and the international law that came with it, the UN system, human rights international law, has never been in our favor, and at this point, at least from a Latin American point of view, it feels more like a dreamy parenthesis of a welfare state and human rights in some privileged countries, leftovers of social security and restricted democracy for others, and a permanent state of war and deprivation for the majority of the world, especially in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. This means that the whole idea that the normal functioning of capitalism is a welfare state, a parliamentary democracy, and human rights is a kind of historiographical mind game that we play on ourselves, which leads us to believe that now that we have this even more aggressive form of capitalism, we should aim at going back to that golden age of full employment, for whom, in which countries, of industrial development, again, for whom, up to what point of environmental destruction, and economic growth, for whom and measured how. Let's not forget that before the Euro-American Golden Age, we experienced for centuries an even more violent moment of capitalism, both inward, conquering indigenous land or super-exploiting workers, and upward in a particular cruel wave of colonial expansion, like the one we appear to be experiencing now. So seeing this light, the struggle against neoliberalism is not just about dismantling the set of policies implemented by Pinochet, Thatcher, Reagan, and Roger, not only about opposing the power of the US, Europe, and the international financial institutions, but to look towards a new future and work toward the actual society we hope to build, not facing the ghost of a predefined idea of how the world works, but to see the actual challenges posed by an authoritarian turn of liberal democracies, that mix of neoliberal and authoritarianism everywhere now in the world, by the challenges that are posed by social, political, indigenous movements without enough political power, the emergence of a new far right everywhere in the world, and the resounding drums of war that travel the world from Ukraine to the Middle East, and worst of all, pushing the political establishment even of faraway countries to start arming themselves with new and more military and repressive technology probably bought from Israel. The current situation in Palestine is probably a summary of all these challenges, which point to the painful recognition of how impotent we still are against the power of Euro-American imperialism. So, how do we explain that Labour implemented Rogernomics, that the center-left coalition that included the Socialist Party deepened the Chilean dictatorship model, that the current progressive government of Boric is adopting some of the aspects of the platform of the right? We can talk, of course, about betrayal and selling out, but we can also try to see what's beneath or beyond the intentions of the political actors involved in those moves. There is something that underlies these transformations, whether they happen during a dictatorship, during a Labour government, or a progressive one. The world economy is the main actor since the end of the World War II, and there's no understanding of our national economies and public policies without reference to the ups and downs, the booms and busts of oil and commodity prices. This is even more relevant for countries that are based on exports of raw materials, agricultural, fish and cattle products, or depending heavily on foreign investment to the national balance, or tourism, for instance. Therefore, in those confusing moments, we need to see what is unavoidable rather than what's willingly chosen by government officials. We need to look, I think, at the continuity of state policies, of capitalist state policies, beyond the transient government or administration. I think we need to look at those aspects of policy and economic trends that respond to the deep character of our colonial capitalist countries and what it needs to survive. I think neoliberalism was a way for capitalism to survive, not an evil plan that was implemented to attack unions or make people suffer. Those were the consequences of those moves, right? But the neoliberal transformation in itself is capitalism working perfectly, right? It's not an extreme of capitalism. I also wanted to add a note on colonialism and how in these times we see an impact on how we conceive of historical time. Going back to the revolt in 2019 in Chile, the revolt began with a hike in the subway fare, as I said, 30 pesos, about 5 cents. During the revolt, the slogan, it's not about 30 pesos, it's about 30 years, became one of the most famous slogans. And it was a critique of those 30 years of neoliberal administrations in the post-dictatorship period. And it was a critique of the time frames with which we organize our rage. And we were soon able to see that the conflict had not begun with the rise in the price of transportation, but with 3 decades of democratic administration of dictatorial legacies. So what the revolt did is it introduced a new notion of time. It was also a revolt against our conventional historical time frames. But this is what happens. When timelines are shattered, there's no turning back. And soon, the streets and memories exploded in new assessments of where our misfortune began. In reality, it was almost 50 years the coup in 1973, in the beginning of the dictatorship, and the force of gravity of that September 11 never ceases to pull everything towards itself. As a Palestinian, I just want to compare this with the Nakba, with the way that May 1948 is the black hole of Palestinian memory, around which the historical forms of memory and the paths of resistance are violently arranged. But also in the revolt of 2019, the greatest challenge to our national history was present. The more than 200 years of our republic that was built on the basis of a double war of expansion to the north against Peru and Bolivia, and to the south, which in its wake expanded its borders and constituted the colonized subsoil on which its civilized edifice was built. In 2019, the Huenufoye and the Huñelfe, the Mapuche flags, were present everywhere, and they reminded us again of a timeline of centuries, not decades, not a few pesos. Centuries that were marked by the rhythm of the permanent pacification of Gualmapu, the territory in the south, and the mestizo consolidation of the Chilean capitalism. So it was not about 30, it was not about 50, it was about more than 500 years of history. And the drama of whole history and historiography is that it cannot but write history from within that same history. And if one adopts the position of the indigenous peoples who were crossed by the Chilean borders, and the same happened with the Peruvians and Bolivians in the north, the Chilean borders crossed them, there's no extemporaneous, something that is no extemporaneous, but there's a full continuity in the experience of a 500-year oppression. The Spanish colonial project gave rise to the state of Chile through the independence war, which marked the birth of a country that was proud of its struggle for freedom and autonomy from the colonial oppressor. But from the point of view of a people who has experienced the continuity of both moments, both colonialism and the republic, the early colonization and the birth of a capitalist republic, the history of Chile, is not so different from that of Israel in Palestine, or that of British New Zealand in Aotearoa. It is a permanent state of war which will only end with the extermination of the indigenous population or with the radical transformation of a colonial regime into an anti-colonial socialist democracy. And so, just to finish, I feel that there's a connection between this deep historical continuity between colonialism and capitalist republics and the more recent waves of struggles against neoliberalism, both in Chile and other countries. In Chile, The dictatorship and the transition to democracy are two moments of the same long process of transformation of the way of organizing the reproduction of our lives. The transformation had its maximum expression in the violent destruction of the living body of those who sustained a revolutionary project or those who opposed the dictatorship. But its deepest and most extensive expression is in the destruction of popular organizations and the reorganization of social relations embodied in the precariousness of basic service, housing, education, employment, in the increase of consumption on the basis of debt, and the radical political exclusion of popular sectors. And again, this is not due to the perverse planning of policymakers or the betrayal of politicians. It's due to the same dynamics that has guided every radical change in the history of capitalism. Keep the business running in the best possible way given the global circumstances. Whether it's free trade agreements or protectionist policies, whether it's closed borders or expansionist wars, the main thing is to keep the loop of capital accumulation going. So I want to end by saying that in times like this, in a time of crisis, wars, defeats, and the rise to power of a new extreme right, we must look at the continuities in the struggle throughout generations and iterations of capitalism. No defeat is final, something which is painfully known to the Maori and the Mapuche after centuries of struggle after struggle. And this is also true of the workers' movement and the international left. The people never cease to be mobilized, whether through daily invisible resistance in times of paralyzing repression, or through active mobilization to change the world. So let's not forget that collective memory is powerful, and then when the time comes, the people will pick up the fight where they left off the last time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. What we're going to do now is take a little 5-minute break. There's no food and stuff, but 5 minutes for toilets and hanging out, and then we'll come back here and do a Q&A, maybe half an hour. I'm not sure how we'll go, but yeah, 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for a Q&A. Thank you. All right. We'll try and do under half an hour of questions and things, but we're going to keep it simple. Stick your hand up, and whoever's most interesting goes first. And oh my God, there's lots of hands. Let's go there first. Yep.
All right. Good. That was really stimulating, and I really appreciate that you opted to engage with the theme of the conference and really try and clarify the stakes of it and really bring out what it really means. Specifically, when you tried to, I think you mentioned the phrase radical change towards the end, and I felt that you were really bringing up the question of crisis and what it means. Crisis as a transition, as something that isn't just something that you experience, but something that experiences you. And you seem to use that to refer to neoliberalism as kind of not the end in itself, but the means of capitalism, and something that had certain underlying necessity or causality beneath it that wasn't just contingent and variable. I just wanted to ask about the other side of that equation, because you brought in the matter of history and the meaning of history, and how we our notions of historical time can become shattered, to use your words. So my question is, what forms of consciousness do you believe capital needs to survive?
Could you just elaborate a little further on the idea of consciousness and capital in that phrase, in that question?
Sure. Well, it's up to you. But basically, you emphasise neoliberalism in its economic kind of aspect. I want to know what you think of neoliberalism in a subjective aspect, like how are we reproducing neoliberalism, and how does it bear upon the working class, and what revolution means to you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I mentioned something in what I read about how we tend to associate neoliberalism with a way of life, right? Individualism and consumerism and all that. I think I'm a bit too orthodox in this, but I truly believe that we as individuals are a product of our context, historical context, social context, our personal relations, and most of all, we are strongly determined by our practices, our activity, and mainly our work, right? How we work and where we work, and whether we have a wage work or unwaged work, and how that relates to other people in our lives, etc. So I think that if we think that the central issue is when we talk about capitalism, is how work is organized, how we organize the reproduction of life in that sense. We are strongly determined by that kind of organization. So the way we work and how many hours and how we get to work and all of that. And so I think that the kind of emergent consciousness and subjectivity of this moment of capitalism is in a deep crisis right now, because we see that there are moments of permanence when you have a more permanent subjectivity, like, I don't know, like the golden age of industrial capitalism in some countries, right? And so that's why the left could count on industrial workers with overalls being like the leaders of the movement or whatever, right? Like the stereotypes. And now we have a subjectivity that is completely in crisis, and let's just think about, for instance, a crisis in sexual relations and the way feminism has transformed the way we think and our morals and our ethics and the way we understand sexual relationships in general. That's a very important part of the reproduction of life. It's not a secondary thing at all, right? The way we organize family, right? And so I think that, again, capitalism is very able to adapt to new moments of its own dynamic. I'm not saying that it's like an automatic dynamic, that there's no agency for people in any way, but I think that maybe like the one-liner of my talk is neoliberalism is just the consequences of capitalism, and we need to confront the causes of capitalism. And the basis of that is how we organize our work, how we organize our lives in this broad sense that I'm speaking of, not just like waged work, and how we organize the reproduction of lives, what kind of institutions serve that reproduction. And so that sometimes will involve classic working class 20th century politics, and sometimes will involve identity politics, and sometimes will involve, I don't know, different kind of like contradictions in all those struggles. So I think that, yeah, I think that's my, I don't know if that answers your question, but trying to, yeah, work on
You clarified something, that's good.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, with the fight starting in 2019 with Chile, and then it ended in a loss in the electoral system, I guess I want to know more along the lines of what you think about electoralism within a socialist context, and whether revolutionary ideas or revolutionary politics can exist in an electoral system like that.
That's a great question. because I think that the revolt shifted I mean, it was also a revolt within the left in Chile, and for some, it depended on how you assessed the revolt. For some people, it was a revolution that was happening. That meant the people were uprising against capital and the state, and there was going to be a revolution, right? For others, including myself, we thought that it was a popular rebellion, a revolt, an uprising that had more to do with the daily lives of Chileans rather than the structural elements of capitalism in the state in Chile or in the world. So the extent of the achievements of the revolt depended on how you assess that revolt, right? Me and my organization, Solidarity, we thought that it was not a revolution, but it was a very interesting moment in our history that opened the opportunity to deepen the political crisis that we were experiencing in order to break the consensus of neoliberal center-left administrations or right-wing governments that were doing basically the same, and break the consensus even within the labor movement and within the environmental movement that what we needed was just more access to resources in whatever form, but we needed a radical transformation of our institutions. And so how this connects with electoral politics is that when the agreement of November 15th came, which outlined the constitutional process, that was a way for the government to divide the movement, because they knew that some people were going to be against that agreement. I mean, we were all against the agreement, but some people thought that we had to accept the new terrain, that there was going to be a constitutional process and that we had to be part of that, because that's a consequence of our revolt, and we should accept that and I mean, and like just like go with it. Of course, with a lot of skepticism and all. But there were others who completely mistrusted the process and were not involved. And they even called for not voting for any of the representatives or not being part of the process in any way. Not even in a way that was like, I don't know, like organizing assemblies outside the constitutional place and, I don't know, like discussing or debating the elements that this new constitution. No, they were just like completely against it. Those groups don't exist anymore. And the problem is that the way they understood, the fact that they understood the revolt as a revolution, made them think that we could ignore the electoral process that was going to happen and not accept it as, with all our weaknesses, the terrain for us to work on. And I have always been very skeptical of electoral tactics. I think it's a swamp for most people. The state is a swamp, and if you go into it, people who have been into institutions know that it's like it's impossible to do most things. But with the revolt, with the constitutional process, we had the experience of a political institution that was not part of the capitalist state. It was a new kind of institution. It was democratically elected. It had some democratic participation. It was self-representation by the people. And that gave us a new experience. And part of that experience, and I'll end with this, is that we have to think of electoral moments and electoral tactics as a means to an end. And that means that it's not about accumulating social movements and power in order to get someone elected, but use whatever space the elections give us to have more visibility and mobilize people in a direction and propose our ideas, even if we don't win, right? And not believe that we're supposed to do the best campaign and elect someone who can be the best councillor or MP or president or whatever. It's not about that. It's about, because if you're accumulating power to go into the institutions, what you're doing is basically capitalizing and then investing that capital in the institutions. I think we need to see it the other way around. We need to capitalize on electoral moments to invest in self-organization and popular organizations. There's one here.
Hi, Pablo. Thank you. From Indonesia, a nation that's where the left has long been decimated. You're basically non-existent in Indonesia. I guess my question is more of, would you care explaining a bit on why the 67% have chosen, again, I guess, going back to the old constitution, many of us on the left were really much hoping for that. I've been following Chile's work for many years as well. And I think coming from Indonesia as well, I'm always interested on that transition, that constantization from authoritarianism, neoliberalism to socialism. Would you mind sharing tactics, strategies on how that was done on grassroots level? That would be great. Thank you.
Even the transition from the dictatorship to the
more democratic. Socialism, yeah.
Well, the first question about how to explain the fact that we lost. No one knows, actually. We're still, it's like that, I can't remember, but people, I think people asked Mao about what his take on the French Revolution was, and he said it's too soon to know. I think it's still too soon to know why, but I have a hypothesis. I think that there are two things. One is that we're politically, when the revolt started, we were already too weak, politically speaking. And that means we didn't have political groups or parties or movements or however you want to call it. We didn't have the kind of organization that you need for a revolt to become something more than just the expression of grievances. We didn't have an actual program or a platform so that when you're confronted with a constitutional process, with the drafting of a new constitution, you know exactly what to put in that draft, right? And not being confused about whether, I don't know, like dividing the country in regions or provinces is relevant or not. So just an example, there were several committees in the Constitutional Convention Assembly, and the one about like the whole debate about the economy, it was part of the same committee that was supposed to talk about environmental rights and nature and all, and so the president, the chair of that committee was a leftist, environmentalist activist who has like an anti-development perspective, and so the economy debate was nowhere. And so we were talking about rights, right? Political rights, civil rights, but we were not talking about the deep issues about who's supposed to invest and where and what to do with the public funding. Should the state have public companies or not? Those debates were absent. And so that kind of preparation, political preparation, was absent even before the revolt began. I think that's part of the reasons. That's one of the reasons, the lack of political experience and preparation. So in more classical terms, for those who are from the more 20th century school, we didn't have a party, we didn't have a strategy, we didn't have a program. That's basically one of the reasons why we lost. But that's more for the left to try to understand. But the other thing is the power of the media in Chile. And the strategy that the right-wing parties took when they realized that they were in a minority in the Constitutional Convention. They had less than 30%. Most of the articles of the draft had to be approved by 2/3, and they couldn't even block those decisions. So they were lost. There was nothing they could do. So what they did, I think they were very smart about this, is that they decided that the constitutional process itself was meaningless. It was not about this debating the content of the Constitution. So the representatives there were either turning the whole thing into a circus or trying to block the more radical things not to give them more publicity. But what they did was that they started to decide to create the strategy for the referendum. So they had a year and a half in advance, a strategy to win the election, while we, and I mean the people who were mobilized in any way around the constitutional change, were thinking about which social rights should be enshrined in the new charter. Right? And so we didn't spend enough time talking to our neighbors about that. And so when the campaign came, the campaign before the referendum, the right wing had a very precise narrative about the new constitution. They're going to take away your house, even though the constitution enshrined and guaranteed the right to housing, to universal housing. They want to turn Chile into 13 different countries, one for each indigenous group, and all kinds of stupid things. And there were some studies and polls after the referendum, and people who voted against, when they were asked why they voted against the Constitution, the draft, their arguments were the things that were there in the Constitution. They said, because I wanted the right to housing, and they were going to take away my house. And it's like, we're like, fuck, there is no way around that. A friend once said, it was very easy for the right and for the reactionaries to win, because everyone has access to a television in Chile. And so in every home, they were continually receiving the propaganda of the people who were against the Constitution. And in order to know more about the arguments for the Constitution, you needed to know someone who was involved and convinced that this was a good change, and we're not enough. And so I think those two are reasons for that, and I don't think I can respond to the other question.
Thank you.
Mark's going to start.
Let's go with, I really want to hear Angus's question, but let's go with Sam first.
I think I share with you quite a frequent frustration that much of what is supposed to be the left, even the radical left, seems to accept a huge amount of capitalism in our everyday lives as just absolutely normal and beyond even thinking beyond that. And the only time, with very rare exceptions, mostly when I experience something else is when I go to Aotearoa Māori, into a Māori community, where things like mutual aid is just an absolutely normal way of life. And I wondered if the sort of radicals in Chile, do you have that connection with Mapuche people, you know, in their communities? What is the relationship between the two? Are you learning from them? That's what I'm asking, really.
It's a great question. There's been since the early 90s, there was a process of revival of the Mapuche struggle, because a lot of people who were from the communities went back to the communities, started learning their language and customs and everything, because they were decimated. Also, the Mapuche population in Chile is very small. Most of them live in urban settings. There's a small part of them that live in the communities, trying to rebuild their ancestral ways. And so there's this weird mix of Mapuche in the cities that are politicized and they were part of the constitutional process, for instance, and they are part of the debates of the left. And there's another part that is that include groups involved in armed struggle against the Chilean state and the forestry industries that are, they want to rebuild their ancestral communities and the religious authority, etc., etc. And there's been a tense relationship between the left and the Mapuche communities all the time, because they feel that the left has never understood their perspective in terms of how they think about autonomy. The left of the 60s, for instance, thought of the Mapuche as peasants, redefined them sociologically as peasants in order to take away the ethnic specificity, right? Which is something that probably happened here and everywhere where there's an indigenous group. So I think that there's a lot to learn from the Mapuche in the sense that in some of the things that I said, that there's a continuity of the struggle. There's a perspective of how to live without a state or against the state, even including armed struggle. But I think, and this is a tough debate, but I also think that we need, at least as socialists or communists or leftists in general, I think we also need to be critical of how some of the economic ways that some indigenous groups understand their autonomy are a reproduction of small ownership of property. And that's dangerous for a perspective for the future, because we don't want to go back to a moment where we don't want to, the same way we don't want to go back to the golden age of capitalism, the 60s or 50s. I think we shouldn't be deciding to go back to a moment where there's like shared ownership that is not universal, that it's for one group or other group and the next group, and then there's borders among them and between them. I think for me at least, we cannot renounce the utopia of communism, of complete and universal ownership of everything by everyone. And I think that we need to engage in that debate with, if you're not part of an indigenous group, we need to engage with them in that debate. I think it's arrogant of us to think that we cannot debate those basic tenets of those communities. The idea that the Chileans or the New Zealanders cannot debate with Maori or the Mapuche about that, like they wouldn't, I don't know, understand the debate, or that they would be offended by it. I mean, if someone is offended by the fact that I'm questioning the economic institutions of their society, it's going to be difficult to work together, right? And I think we need to find that sort of like, leave behind the guilt that most leftists feel when it comes to indigenous communities, and try to work in a more equal kind of solidarity in the debate, right? Recognizing the legacies of exclusion and oppression, including in our demands their autonomy, and recognizing that they have a right to self-determination. But this is why, for the ones who were here last night, that's why I made that question for the conference here, is that I think that we cannot go back to small ownership of land. That's a part of the problem too. It's not progressive, I think.
I think we're going slightly over time. Angus, you had a question.
You can wrap up if you want.
Yeah, I think we might wrap up because there's a party soon, so that's exciting. So just give some applause for Pablo. Really great having you here. I mean, I know you're here for a wee while, but it's been really good having you at the conference and lots of interesting ideas. And I think just to wrap up, Kieran's going to do a quick talk. Because this is the final event of our weekend, apart from the after party with the drinking stuff. Oh, and I've got a present for Papa.
You saw the present. Well, he saw the present. I'll just do a very quick wrap up. So this is kind of the last substantive part of the conference, from 9 p.m. at 13 Garrett Street, which is opposite people in the scholar. We're going to have like a little after party, pretty low key, bit of music. Fergus in the back is going to be DJing, and yeah, just going to hang out and chat and have fun. But it's BYO as well. So there was some discussion and some chats about when liquor licenses allow you to sell alcohol on a public holiday. So I'd suggest if you do want to get some drinks, you should probably go soon. Fresh choice. But yeah, as far as the conference goes, thanks for everyone who's come, thanks for everyone who's helped out, especially thanks to the committee, thanks to Wellington Socialist Society, kind of core cadre, is that the right word? It's a bit anachronistic, you know what I mean? And yeah, I hope if this is the first time you've engaged with our organisation, that you will engage again, become a member, get involved. It's really, the more the merrier as far as we're all concerned. There's lots of work to be done, we think, and we'd love to have you as an active member of our various groups. There's a sign-up sheet at the back that you can join our mailing list, or you can actually become a member. So yeah, thanks, and we hope to see you all again soon in another similar conference.